Tech by Tips.
Welcome to another Tech by Tips video. In today's video, we're starting the section number 2 of our Introduction to Azure DevOps series. And in today's video, we're going to be covering the types of source control that we have available in Azure DevOps. And additionally, we're going to cover how to manage the Git repositories. And we're going to cover the branch authorizations and the policies that can be applied to branches. So that's basically like the management part for the Azure repos, and we're going to cover the two types that we have. And but for the majority of the section, we're going to be covering Git, because Git is the one source control that is going to be used the most nowadays, and so that's where we're going to focus on that. So let's get to that. Switch. And here, the first thing that we're going to cover is the types of source control. We have in Azure DevOps two ways to manage our code, and that's using a centralized source control that is like an old way that is still supported but is not recommended, which is the centralized source control using the Team Foundation server. And we also have the decentralized source control, which is a new way that most companies are working now, which is using Git, so Git repositories. And that's normally what you'll see that teams and companies create nowadays. It's very rare that you see a company creating a Team Foundation server source control type. But they're there. They're just supporting it because there's big companies that have old projects that started there, and that's why they still support it. So mainly the differences here are going to be, first of all, is when you're working with Team Foundation server, everything is being done against a server. So the server holds everything, all the code, all the changes, and what you do when Team Foundation server is that you connect to the server, you get the latest version of that code that you want to work in, and then you make changes to that locally. And in Git it works kind of similar, but it changes in the way that you pull information from the server, right? In the Team Foundation server, for anything that you do with your code, you always connect to the server. It's a constant connection to the server for anything. Like if you want to see something that was committed before to the code, you have to connect to the server will give you that information and you'll see it, right? But with Git, it works different, because when you connect to Git and when you clone a repository, you basically get a copy of everything that exists in that source, in that repository, and then you have everything that has ever been done with that locally and the changes that you're making locally. So that's the main difference that you see here. If you want to, for example, see a previous commit in Team Foundation server, it has to connect to the server then gives you that information, and that's all that you can see. But with Git, you have the whole repository and everything locally, so you can go back and forth without having to connect to the server, right? So the main thing is you only connect to the server in Git whenever you need to make a change or get changes that other people have made that you still don't have, right? While for Team Foundation server, for anything you do, you have to connect to the server. And another interesting thing is that for you to work on something in the Team Foundation server, you have to check out files, right? So basically the server marks those files as being worked on by you, and it locks the files. So while you check out a file and you're working on it, nobody else can make changes to those files. Those files are locked, and only you can make changes to those files, which is good when it comes to nobody making any changes that you have to kind of deal with when you're pushing your code, but at the same time it's bad because only one person can work on a file at a time. While in Git, since you have everything in your computer, every person has a copy of everything, multiple people can be working on the same file, and you're just working locally, and there's not going to be any lock, right? The only problem is that whenever you're going to push your code to the server, then if someone pushed already something to that, then you're going to have to see what changes they made and adjust your your code to keep what that person changed plus what you did. And another thing that is a difference with Team Foundation Server is that it allows you to specify access controls to specific files, while Git does not give you that granular access control at the file level. You only have access control at the repository level. And another big constraint in the Team Foundation Server is that you can only have one repository per team project. So if you're working on multiple things, those are going to have to be different folders inside that repository. While in Git, you can have as many repositories as your team needs, and you can have, for example, one repository for one app, another repository for another app. So it's very good in that it allows you to have that flexibility of segregating the code as you need. And then, like I said, the Team Foundation Server is no longer recommended for new projects. It's just there to support all the existing projects that use that. And it is recommended and is basically the default now for everybody to use Git for new projects. Now, we can manage the Git repositories in the Azure DevOps platform. And one of the things is it allows you to manage permissions for the repositories, and you can do it several ways. You can do it based on a group or based on an individual. So you always have that flexibility of how to assign different permissions. And the best practice is to always go with the least privileges model. So by default, you would be denying access to people, right? And you will only grant them, you only allow permissions as they're needed, right? And then another thing that we have the ability to do when we're managing our Git repositories is that we can import a repository from another source control. For example, like a platform like GitHub, right? So you have the opportunity of, if you already had that there, you had GitHub Enterprise, or you were using the regular GitHub, you can import that into Azure DevOps easily. Now, for branch authorizations and policies, we can get down to that level. Not only at the repo level, but we can also restrict and change permissions at the branch level. So it allows you to do it the same way. You can do it via a group, or you can do it via individuals. And again, the best practice is to always use the least privileges. So by default, you deny everything, and then as needed, you allow people to do things. And it allows you also, for example, to lock branches, so that no changes are allowed in that branches. Let's say, for example, you have some branch that you are not going to make any changes to. You want to keep that as a reference or a history or something like that. You can lock it, and then nobody can change that branch. And there are several policy rules that also you can apply to the branches that are based on other things, like, for example, work items and the discussions of pull requests and results of automation and pipelines. So those are good things that we have access to, and that's what we're going to cover. So let's jump into the platform and kind of quickly go over where you do all those things and discuss them a little bit. Alright, we are back in Azure DevOps, and we are in the boards where we were last time. So now we're going to go into the repos on the left side here. And remember, when we created a project, we specified a way that we wanted to store our code. In this case, we made sure that our Agile project used Git. So that's why automatically it's going to show me here that the project is empty, add some code, and then it gives me how to use Git to clone that repository so that I can start working on it. But from here, we also have the option, like we mentioned before, of importing our repository. So if we had, for example, something in GitHub, we could just click here, that button, and then specify here what type of repository it is, if it's a Team Foundation server or a Git repository. For example, if it's a Git repository, then you can put the GitHub URL, like this example shows here. That says https://github.com/microsoft/vscode.git. And then if you need to provide credentials because this is a private repository, then you select this and you put those credentials here. If not, then you don't need that, and then it'll clone that and import it into your repository. So that's the first way that you can import a repository to your project. And if we look down here at the bottom, we also have the option of initializing a main branch with a readme file or a git ignore file. You can also remove this if you don't want it to have a readme file, and it'll just create a main branch that only has like a git ignore if you select it here. If not, then it just doesn't give you an option to initialize the branch. So let's just add a readme here and then just initialize it blank. When we click here, then it creates our main branch. As you can see here on the top, we only have one branch and it's main. And in this branch, we have our readme file. So now we have initiated in our Agile project our repository here that has a readme. But we have other ways to manage the repositories. Now that we have a working repository with the main branch, we can click here. This is where we would change if we had more than one repository in our project. And then we have an option here to create a new repository, to import another repository, or to manage the repositories. So in this case, I'm going to go into the manage repositories, and it is going to load a new web interface that shows us the current repositories that we have in this project. In this example, we only have the Agile project repository inside the Agile project, but we have options here that we can do with this repository. So we can go into the settings, and in here, there's a few settings here. For example, we can specify the name of the default branch for new repositories. By default, it's going to be main. So that's an option that you can set up here. And then you can turn this on or off if you want to allow users to manage the permissions for the branches that they create. That's on by default. So you can also enable advanced security for new repositories here if you want. And then here on the right side we go, and we have the policies that can be applied to the repository at the repository level. So this talks about the different policies that we can apply. For example, in order for a commit to be pushed, email has to follow certain validation. So you can do that here, and then it gives you how you want to do the validation. And you can also do a file path validation here. So you can specify a pattern for files. It also allows you to do case enforcement. So this is used to avoid case sensitivity conflicts. So you can block pushes that change the casing on the files, folders, branches, and tags. And here you can also specify reserved names. So in this case, you can block certain names so that they cannot be used. And then here we have a maximum path length. So you can say, the whole path cannot exceed a certain amount. And also the same with a file size. So a file cannot be more than a certain size. And here in security is where we would go at the repository level and manage the permissions of users or groups. So in this case, here we can see that, for example, I have here by default selected the build administrators, and we can see the permissions that are assigned to this group. So you can see if a permission is set, it'll say if it's allowed or denied. If it's not set, it'll just say not set, and you can make changes here based on what you need. Like we said, the best practice is to deny everything and only allow things that are necessary, and use also inheritance for that. So you have the option to have different groups. You have the administrators, for example. You have contributors. Contributors have different sets of permissions. You have people that only have access to read, for example, people that can administer the project, etc. You can create your own groups. Here you can delete the groups if you don't want a group. And you have specific users too. For example, in here we have Agile Project Build Service for Tech by Tips, and that has certain permissions assigned to it. So that's basically how you see what comes by default here. If we have a create button right here on the top right, if we select there, then this is where we create a new repository because we're in the repositories. So this will basically add a new repository here to the repositories tab. Now, all the things that we covered up here is generic. It applies for all the repositories that are shown under here. But if I want to specifically make changes in the permissions or the policies for a specific Git repository, I can just click into it. And then once I click into that repository, then I have the settings for that specific repository. So for example, for this Agile project, we can see that forks are enabled, commit mention linking is enabled, etc. You can basically go into the details about what all of these are. This is really not going to be part of what we want to cover. This is just an introduction. So you can manage those settings for that specific repository by clicking on it, and then you'll see that. The same with the policies. Once you click on it and you select policies, it's going to be the policies that are applied to this specific repository. In here, like we said, it's the same policies that we had that we could apply before for everything. So that's also there available. And then when it comes to security, in here we have the options to give permissions to groups and to users. In this case, for example, I show up here as a user because I'm the only user in the organization, and I can change my permissions here. In my case, you see that I have basically all of the permissions here except for the first two. But you always have the opportunity in an enterprise environment to add more people, and that'll be just as simple as searching here for a user or a group. In my case, my organization only has one person, so that's what shows up. But if you had others, you could just search here for that. And then when you select them, it'll add them here, and then you can select the permissions that you want to add to that person, and it'll show it up here in the list of permissions. Additionally, we have another tab here that says approvals and checks, and in here you can embed certain things like restrictions and approvals and things of the sort. So you can go here into view all checks, and it'll give you all the options that you have. For example, if you want approvals to be done for the code to be deployed and things along those lines, for example, establishing business hours so that deployments are only triggered on specific times and things along those lines. This is more of an advanced topic, so we're just going to mention it right now. We're not going to cover exactly anymore. But yeah, that's basically at the repository level what we can do here to change the repository. We can rename also here the repository. So we have that button here on the top right where you can do that. And if we click on browse, then it'll just take us back to where we can actually see the code. And in here, you have the option to clone the repository so that you can pull that locally to your machine. If you do that, then it'll give you a link that you can use to clone with the IDE or just the HTTP or SSH link that you use to do that. You need to have credentials if you're using it in an enterprise environment, because you need to make sure that the access to this is restricted. But this is how you clone a repository. You have the three dots here with more actions where you can create forks. You can create files and folders inside the code. You can upload files, and you can get it all down as a zip. You're probably very familiar with this. This is a general feature that you find in most Git places, like GitHub also has something similar to that. And in here, if you click on setup build, then you can go into the pipelines to actually do CI/CD for building your code. So that's why you have that accessible over here. So now the other thing that we want to talk about is we can see more details at the branch level, but I don't have a branch. I just have the main branch. I don't have any other branch. So how do we create a branch? Easily, we go up here where we see the name of our branch, and then we have an option here that says create a new branch. So if we click this button, we can create a test branch that is based on the main branch. So the way Git works is you're gonna have your main branch, which is where all your code is gonna be deployed to as an end result, and that's like your working product, right? And then you usually create a branch for a story or a feature that you're working on, right? So normally, if you follow good practices, this name of the branch would be something that is related to that. It could be, for example, you could have the name of the story or the number of the story that you have in your board, and then some description. Oh, I'm sorry, I cannot put a dash in there. So let's do that. So the name of the story or the task, and then the description, right, of what this is about. And then you say we want to base it on main, right? And here you can pick also the work item that you want to link, so that there's that linkage between the code and the board. So you can, from the card in the boards, you can directly link and come back here to the code. So you can do that here, for example. You can select that, and then it'll link it to that user story. So this is great. You should always use this if you can. So you can just link it like that and then don't put the code, or actually put the code there and also link it. And then if we click create, then we'll see that now we have two branches. We have the main branch here, which is where all of our code is going to end by default, and that's what we're going to be deploying and building upon. And then we have the things that we're currently working on, so that's why it says mine, right? So if you see, I have a check mark here in the branch that we created because we just moved to work on our branch, right? So all the changes that we make are being made to our branch, but we can always move back and forth. So if I select here the main, now we're back into the main branch and you'll see the check mark on the main, right? But you don't work on the main, you always work on your branch. So you work here on your branch, and that's how you create a branch, right? And now if we go back up here and we say manage repositories, and we go into Agile project, then when we go into the Agile project, then you'll see, for example, when you go into the policies, that down here you have something that says branch policies, and in that we have our main branch, which is the default branch, and we also have our new branch that we created to work on something. So now I can actually click on a specific branch, and you'll see that now it went one level down. Now we're looking at the branches. We have the main and we have the other branch, and we can apply different branch policies here. So this allows us to make changes to the policies and the security permissions at the branch level, which is great if you want to do that. And previously we mentioned that we could have a branch, for example, that we wanted nobody to work on, just keep it as it is, so we can lock it, right? But this is something that we cannot do here. For that, we have to go back into the repos here, and then we'll go into the branches. And in here, we'll see all the branches that we currently have. So this allows us to do things, for example, to lock the branch, to create a new branch. You can have that button there to do that. And you can delete branches and stuff like that. So for example, let's say we want to lock this branch 1, 2, 3, 4 test. So for that, we go to the very right here where we have the more options with the 3 dots. We click there, and then we see some options here. For example, we can do a lock, and you see the little lock here. So that means that that branch is locked and no longer any changes can be applied to that. You can unlock it too if you had locked it by accident, so you can go and click that. You can also manage the policies and the security directly here if you find it easier to do it this way, because when you click branches, you'll immediately come to the branch level and you see all this stuff there. And you can also say, for example, in this case, we see this thing that says default here on the main. Let's say that you want to change that and you want the 1, 2, 3, 4 to be the default branch for your repository. You can do that here. We click on the 3 dots and then we say, make this the default branch. And as you can see now, the 1, 2, 3, 4 is the default branch. You can always go back, so you can go to the other branch, which is the master, and then set as default again. So that's something that you don't have to worry about if you do it by accident. You can always revert back. You have more options here, for example, comparing branches. So you can do like a git compare on branches. You can look at the history of a branch. So if you click on view history, then you'll see all the commits that have been pushed to the code. Let's go back again. You also have the option here to view the files in that branch. So if we click here, it'll take us back to that view where we see all the files that are there. We can go back again. We have the option to delete the branch, create a new pull request from that branch, or just create a new branch. So those are mainly the options. Let's delete this one. We don't need it. So let's delete the branch. It says branch 1, 2, 3, 4 test will be permanently deleted. Are you sure you want to proceed? We say delete, and that gets rid of that branch, and we're back to having only our main branch. So that's the main things that I wanted to cover on this video. This is more of the administrative part of the repos, how you create your repos, how you create branches, how you assign permissions and policies and stuff like that. So I'm gonna leave it like that. We've already covered a lot on this video. On the next video, we're gonna start getting our hands dirty in actually working with Git so that you can see something in action going on. But thank you for being here. I'm hoping that you're liking this series. Remember, if you like the content, click the like button, subscribe to the channel if you have not done so, share the videos if you find them useful for other people to learn, and also remember, I do not monetize this channel, so if you want to support me to create this content for you, good quality content, there are links in the description below where you can donate using PayPal or Bitcoin, so I really appreciate it because that'll help me focus on the channel and give you good quality content. So that's gonna be it for this one. See you on the next one,